Just weeks after Virginia voters handed Democrats full control of state government, the opening moves from Richmond are already drawing intense scrutiny, not because of speculation, but because of what has actually happened since the election. I'm Emily Carter, a U.S. political and global affairs analyst, breaking down how power moves beyond the headlines. On November 4th, Virginians elected Abigail Spanberger as governor by a wide margin. Democrats also secured a supermajority in the Virginia House of Delegates and won every statewide office, giving the party unified control of the Commonwealth for the first time in years. The campaign message was clear: moderation, affordability, and bipartisan problem solving. That message resonated across Northern Virginia, in Fairfax County, Loudoun County, Arlington, and Alexandria, as well as in suburban and swing regions that had previously supported Republican candidates like Glenn Youngkin. The result was not just a win, but a mandate. But mandates are tested not by campaign rhetoric, but by early governing decisions. Since taking office on January 17th, Governor Spanberger and her administration have moved quickly, particularly on personnel changes and executive actions, prompting critics to question whether the tone and direction of governance align with the moderate image presented during the campaign. Before even taking the oath of office, the incoming administration requested the resignation of several board members at the University of Virginia who had been appointed under the previous administration. Around the same time, changes were made to legal leadership at institutions including George Mason University and the Virginia Military Institute. Supporters describe these moves as routine transitions of power. Critics argue they represent an unusually aggressive consolidation of control, especially given the governor's emphasis on bipartisanship during the campaign. Within hours of being sworn in, Governor Spanberger also rescinded Executive Order 47, a policy enacted under former Governor Glenn Youngkin that allowed Virginia State Police and the Department of Corrections to coordinate with federal immigration and customs enforcement in cases involving individuals who had committed serious crimes. The administration said the change was intended to allow state and local law enforcement to focus on core responsibilities. Republican lawmakers, including House Minority Leader Terry Kilgore, warned that reducing cooperation with federal authorities could have public safety implications, particularly in Northern Virginia. This immediate back and forth illustrates the central tension of the moment. Voters were promised moderation and affordability. What they are now seeing is a rapid shift in personnel, policy reversals, and a legislature preparing to move a wide-ranging agenda, all within the first weeks of unified Democratic control. And that raises a key question moving forward. Was this pace and direction of change always part of the plan? Or is Virginia now seeing the practical consequences of a political mandate colliding with the realities of governing? That question becomes even sharper once the General Assembly begins advancing legislation. As the focus shifts from executive actions to legislation, the direction of Virginia's new political landscape becomes clearer and more consequential. With Democrats holding a supermajority in the Virginia House of Delegates and control of the state Senate, bills introduced in Richmond no longer face the same internal resistance that shaped previous sessions. That change alone alters what is politically possible. Among the first proposals drawing attention is House Bill 863, legislation that would adjust sentencing guidelines for crimes including rape, manslaughter, and child exploitation offenses. Supporters of the bill argue it reflects a broader criminal justice reform effort focused on rehabilitation and sentencing consistency. Critics counter that reducing minimum sentences for serious violent crimes sends the wrong signal at a time when public safety remains a major concern for voters. Governor Abigail Spanberger did not campaign on criminal justice reform as a central theme. Her campaign messaging instead emphasized safety, moderation, and affordability, making the timing and substance of these proposals particularly controversial. At the same time, lawmakers have begun advancing measures with direct economic implications for Virginia households. Proposed legislation includes expanding the sales tax to additional services, creating new delivery-related fees affecting companies like Amazon and Uber Eats, and accelerating plans to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2028. Supporters frame these proposals as worker-friendly and necessary for modernizing the economy. Business groups and Republican legislators argue they will increase costs for small businesses, reduce hiring, and ultimately raise prices for consumers, particularly in suburban and rural parts of the Commonwealth. Another major area of debate centers on gun policy. Several bills introduced this session would expand firearm restrictions, limit magazine capacity, and impose new taxes and fees related to gun ownership. Advocates say the measures are designed to reduce gun violence. Opponents argue they disproportionately affect law-abiding gun owners and conflict with the Second Amendment protections that many Virginians strongly support. Taken together, these proposals represent a significant policy shift, not because any single bill is unprecedented, but because of the speed and scope with which they are being introduced. This is the advantage of unified control. When one party controls the governor's office, the legislature, and statewide executive positions, policy moves faster. Compromise becomes optional. Institutional friction is reduced. For supporters, this is democracy in action. Voters chose a direction, and elected leaders are implementing it. For critics, it raises concerns about whether voters fully understood how far that direction would go once checks and balances were removed. And the stakes extend beyond individual bills, because once legislation advances, it reshapes institutions, courts, universities, public safety frameworks, and economic incentives in ways that are difficult to reverse. That broader institutional impact is where this story expands next. As legislation moves forward in Richmond, the effects are no longer theoretical. They begin to touch institutions, elections, and long-standing structures that shape how Virginia governs itself. One of the clearest examples is the growing debate around redistricting. Virginia voters amended the state constitution to create a bipartisan redistricting commission designed to limit partisan influence over congressional maps. However, Democratic leaders in the General Assembly have introduced proposals that would weaken or bypass that commission entirely. Supporters argue the current system is flawed and needs reform. Critics contend these efforts amount to a power grab, particularly after public comments from Senate President pro tempore Louise Lucas suggesting future congressional maps could heavily favor Democrats. A Tazewell County Circuit Court judge temporarily blocked the proposal in January, citing procedural issues, though appeals are ongoing. At the same time, attention has turned to Virginia's public institutions. At the Virginia Military Institute, founded in 1839 and long viewed as one of the nation's most prominent state-supported military colleges, lawmakers have introduced measures that could affect future funding and oversight. The debate centers on governance standards and institutional culture, but critics warn the moves risk politicizing a school with deep historical significance to the Commonwealth. These developments have drawn reactions beyond Virginia. National lawmakers, policy analysts, and political strategists are increasingly viewing the Commonwealth as a test case, not just for democratic governance, but for how unified political control reshapes states that once leaned politically competitive. Virginia was a swing state for much of the past 2 decades. Governors like Bob McDonnell and Glenn Youngkin won statewide elections, while Democrats dominated federal races. That balance has shifted rapidly, driven in part by population growth in Northern Virginia, including Fairfax County, Arlington, Alexandria, and Loudoun County, where federal employment and government-adjacent industries are concentrated. For supporters of the current administration, this realignment reflects demographic and economic change. For critics, it raises concerns about whether competitive politics in Virginia are being replaced by permanent one-party dominance. And that leads to an important question for viewers following this story. Do you believe Virginia's recent election results represent a clear mandate for rapid structural change? Or do they highlight the risks of concentrating political power too quickly at the state level? Share your perspective in the comments. Because how Virginia answers that question may shape political strategies far beyond the Commonwealth. As Virginia moves deeper into this legislative session, the broader implications of unified political control are coming into focus, not just for policy outcomes, but for voter trust and institutional stability. Supporters of Governor Abigail Spanberger argue that the pace of change reflects democratic accountability. Voters delivered control of the governor's office, the Virginia House of Delegates, and the state Senate to one party, and that party is now acting on its priorities. From this perspective, the system is working as intended. Critics see it differently. They argue that the speed and scope of early decisions, from executive actions to legislative proposals affecting public safety, taxation, redistricting, and higher education, raise questions about whether campaign messaging fully reflected the governing agenda that would follow. This tension is not unique to Virginia. Across the country, states with unified political control often experience rapid policy shifts, particularly when long-standing institutional constraints are weakened or removed. What makes Virginia notable is its recent history as a politically competitive state, one that elected Republican governors like Glenn Youngkin and Bob McDonnell, while simultaneously voting Democratic at the federal level. That balance is now changing. Northern Virginia's growing influence in Fairfax County, Arlington, Alexandria, and Loudoun County has reshaped statewide elections, giving Democrats a durable advantage in recent cycles. Political analysts note that this realignment has turned Virginia into a case study for how demographic, economic, and institutional factors can transform a state's political trajectory in a relatively short period of time. The question now is not whether change is happening, but how voters respond once consequences become clearer. Legislation passed today affects court systems, public safety frameworks, economic costs, and educational institutions for years to come. Reversing those changes is far more difficult than enacting them. Ultimately, Virginia's next test will not come from speeches or campaign ads, but from lived outcomes: how affordable life becomes, how safe communities feel, how institutions function, and whether voters believe the direction of governance matches the promises they heard. That accountability does not happen overnight. It unfolds over election cycles. If you want more analysis that looks beyond headlines and explains how power, policy, and institutions actually work, consider subscribing to this channel, because understanding how decisions made today shape tomorrow's political reality is becoming more important than ever.